Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for turning up for the a talk on semantic content modeling. I'll introduce myself. So my name is Paul Adams. I'm a senior developer and I work in the DXD team, working on the delivery side of the product. And there's a picture of me. I haven't got a webcam, unfortunately, at the moment. So yeah, you just have to put up with a picture of me with a rather large tie. So this talk entitled Semantic Content Modeling is all going to be based on GraphQL. So hopefully you're familiar with this, but you'll pick it up as you go along if you're not. So that's all good. So this talk's only going to be for like 30 minutes. So hopefully we'll be finishing a bit earlier than that. So if there's any questions, we can always ask them at the end. So to begin, so GraphQL for our public content API. So a little bit of background on our existing offerings. So since the 11 release, we exposed the public API that was based on GraphQL, and we use that to retrieve all the content effectively from the broker database. And the aim of that was to provide a small set of root queries that were easy to use and would allow you to retrieve all the content with quite a small selection of GraphQL queries. It was to replace the older content interaction libraries and hopefully to match all the functionality that existed in those older libraries, and also to make retrieval easy, obviously using a kind of like a software development kit style library, whether it's Java or .NET. It's a bit more difficult to use. You have to obviously add the packages to your project and so on and so forth. So hopefully that would, using GraphQL, it would make it a lot easier to retrieve your content. And of course, because it's on GraphQL, it's building on familiar technologies, so it helps aid your development life cycles. So the point of GraphQL is, of course, it's a query language for your API. It's server-side, and it allows you to use a type system that you can define. That's quite important, we'll see later, but it's not tied to any specific database or storage or persistence. It's literally backed by the data and code that you've defined. Moving on. Okay, so there's a few tricky goals to try and get to here. So the product is complicated and our API surface is large. We have lots of small APIs in one large content interaction library, which is like the umbrella term for it, and it's pretty large. It's obviously quite old, and over time it's been expanded upon, and so it covers a broad range of areas. So the initial release of our public content API couldn't kind of like replicate all that functionality, so you still ended up needing to use the older content interaction library for some functionality, and then you could do like other parts with the GraphQL offering. And some functionality we just couldn't include because it didn't kind of make sense. So we are still favoring obviously our GraphQL API over the old OData, which is what the SIL library was built on, and the in-process API. So we're kind of wanting to stick with this and improve it as we go along. So and also the complexity that you get with these things kind of like spawns like an advent of frameworks. So since it's difficult to use some of these libraries, you kind of end up with frameworks being introduced like DD4T or DXA to kind of like wrap the framework, so you can kind of concentrate on your web development or something, and so you don't have to kind of like make calls into the lower level API. And those kind of frameworks are pretty cool. They offer quite a lot of stuff for you out of the box, but they also introduce kind of like a paradigm that you may not want to use. So in the case of say DXA, you might not wish to be using a model view controller mechanism for your website and so on. So yeah. So the idea of GraphQL all the way down, where we said that you could use it for some bits, but some bits weren't implemented, so you had to switch to the SIL libraries. So we want to obviously get to the GraphQL all the way down, but it's not quite like that. It's a bit tricky. So the kind of publishing pipeline in the content manager plays a significant role in this. And one of the issues is the rendered content from the template building blocks, and that complicates things because it's like so we'll probably use a DXA example throughout this presentation. So hope you're familiar with DXA, but kind of like you're rendering content through template building blocks that could be written by somebody else, and we don't know what that format of that data is. So when you want to access that data from GraphQL, it's hard to kind of like reason about that data, the structure of it. So it's hard to get that content back in a very GraphQL friendly way. So you end up with an all or nothing approach where there's metadata that you can retrieve using GraphQL mechanisms, but the actual content, the bits that are rendered from the template building blocks, it's a big blob of data. Generally, it could be XML or it could be JSON in the case of DXA, and it's just one big chunk of data that you get in one go, as opposed to more fine-grained control. And that's obviously good for some applications. So if we go back to the DXA, the model view controller architecture, where you want to get the entire content of a page in one hit, then that obviously works fine. But it's for other applications, it makes it tricky. It can be worked around with smarter decisions in the content manager. So you can break the structure of your content in certain ways. You can have schemas and different components types and so on and so forth, but it's a little bit harder, and it shifts the emphasis from one place to another. And it also can kind of vary your choice of framework that you may wish to use. So we'll see an example of that. Here we go. So an example is if you wanted to get a page, for example, given a URL, you can see here on the left, you can request the title, the last published date, and that's kind of like available for all pages, but the actual content of that page is not easily returned by using just individual properties, because we can't understand or reason about the content and the structure of that content because it's generated through these template building blocks. So we end up with a property that we expose called raw content, and that returns you, on the right hand side, you can see a big block of JSON. So this is an example from DXA, and then DXA will then deserialize that JSON for you and then deliver your page. But you can see that if we look here, we can there's properties like entities and content, headline, for example, and ideally you'd like to be able to just put headline as a in your GraphQL query and just return that single string, as opposed to having to manage that massive block of content. I mean, performance reasons and usability reasons and so on. So most of the properties of a page are not that interesting, as we say. So publish date, title, and so on and so forth. Yeah, they're useful in some ways, but you're really only interested in the content. That's the stuff that you want to render onto your website. So the content can be large. I mean, from that example previously, you could see a large block of JSON, but that was only a subsection, a snippet of the JSON that's available. I mean, it could be 100K large, it depending on the way you've done it in the content manager. So you really only want a subset, and you want to be able to specify the fields that you want to return. You don't want to have to create any extra content in the content manager to achieve concepts like a scheme, like a teaser. So, for example, you may have a press release component, or news article component, and when rendering that on the page, you're only interested in like a couple of fields. You don't want the entire content of that press release. You may only want the title and the author or something like that. So you'd want to kind of like get access to those directly without having to then have extra content that duplicates things in the content manager. So you want to be explicit with the fields you want to retrieve, and ideally you need to do it, or you want to do it in a GraphQL way. And you want the format for the content easily to deserialize, so anybody can just consume that content and deserialize it and render it without it being a kind of a bespoke structure that whoever created the template building blocks, be it yourselves or a framework like DXA, you know, where you don't really know how that works. Moving on, so this brings us to the actual point of semantic content modeling, and the idea here is quite straightforward. It's so you can define your types, and these types are GraphQL types, and they're defined from schemas that you create in the content manager. So a schema that you create in the content manager now becomes part of your GraphQL type system, and it's done at runtime. Okay, which is pretty important, because we don't want to be exposing types and then but then having to restart services to pick them up. So now the content author can define GraphQL types that make sense and fit the domain of the application. So it breaks you away from the Tridian object model, where you're dealing with pages and components, and you can get all that content back, if you remember, from that raw content field, but there's no, you know, it's just a component. It's like, well, what type of component is it? It's like, how do I render that? And, you know, we're trying to, it's kind of like you're still tied to the Tridian object model there, but you want to be able to say, oh, it's a press release, it's a news article, and I can then render it in any way I wish. And likewise, you need to request just the fields you want. So if you've got a quite a complicated schema defined in your content manager that has, say, 10 properties or 10 fields, and you only, for rendering the landing page, you only want, say, 2 of those fields. You don't want to return all that data back. You just want those 2 fields, then you should be able to easily do it. And because it's defined based off the schema in the content manager, then the property names that you use in the types of GraphQL should reflect the schema that's defined in the content manager. So that's all great, but the question still remains, how do we understand the format of the content? And that's what we'll look at next. So we achieve this through the data publishing pipeline. And the cool thing about this is it's no longer templates or template building blocks. It's out of the box, just publishing JSON, raw JSON. And that JSON is defined based off the schema of that content. And we understand the schema, so we understand the structure of that JSON. So as a result, we can just easily kind of like map types from GraphQL directly to chunks of JSON or properties inside that JSON. And that's perfect really for what we need to do, because we're no longer worried that we might have data that's unstructured that we can't reason about. We know exactly how it's structured because it's kind of a one-to-one mapping based off the schema that's associated with it. So an example would be you define your schema in the content manager on the left-hand side and give it a few properties. So I think in this example, you can see that there's a headline, there's an image, and an article body. And again, those properties or fields can have a type associated with them. So the headline is a text. You can have multimedia links. Article body is an embedded schema. And if we look in the center, you can see that that embedded schema again has fields associated with them, subheading, content, and the text fields can be a rich text field. It can be a component link, multimedia link, or all the types that are available from the content manager. So I'm guessing that everybody here knows or is aware of all this type of stuff in the content manager. And on the right hand side, you can see that I've created a basic article component here that's using that STM article schema, and I've just gave it some content. So once we have this article schema, how does it look once you publish it? So once you publish that article, so the first time you publish that article, that schema will come along for the ride. And in GraphQL, we can then stitch we can generate a type that reflects that those schemas that have been used by that component, and kind of build the type and inject it into the GraphQL type system. And then once you do that, you can then inspect the GraphQL schema, and now you've got access to some new types that are done at runtime. And you can see the one I'm showing here is the paragraph, which was the embedded schema. Hopefully, I'll just go back. Yeah, subheading, content, media, caption, and you can see them here. And that's so once you've published that component, they just automatically appear. The types, the names for each properties come from the actual schema itself. The descriptions of each field come from the descriptions of the fields that you define in the schema. Okay, so you can kind of document your API, if you like, or your type system by just giving them decent descriptions in the CM schema. Okay, and you can see article on the left hand side here, where you can see article body, and it returns you an array of STM paragraph schemas, types even, and so you can do multi-value things as well. So once you get to that point, you can then do a GraphQL query to retrieve the content, but this time those types are known to the GraphQL type system, and so you can use like inline fragments. For example, on here we've got one on the left hand side where I'm doing using a root query called items, which is basically a simple broker search, and I'm asking it to return me all of the article types. So the naming conventions here are it uses title case for generating, upper title case should I say, for generating enums. So as soon as I publish that component, this item type, if it didn't exist, would suddenly get created. So any schema that you create will suddenly appear in there if there's content using it. And then you can see the type casing for the types, and then lower camel case for the properties. And you can see I can then pull out individual content. So I can pull out the headline, get the image. The image, if we go back, apologies if this is too clicky, but the image was a multimedia link here, and the multimedia link type happened to have been a YouTube video. So we can then drill down here and use the fact that it's a YouTube video type, and then we've got properties here, and we can get metadata and article body and so on and so forth. So hopefully you can see it becomes quite intuitive to kind of navigate your data models and explore your content easily. And the kind of screenshots here are just the GraphQL tool that we use, but any GraphQL tool that allows you to navigate your data model can be used, like GraphQL Playground or something like that. But hopefully on the right hand side you can see that the content returned is easy to manage now. It's a simple structure. It's easy to deserialize in your own kind of web applications. So now we do have GraphQL all the way down, so you can retrieve your content in the way you'd expect from GraphQL. So it's not a case of we give you a few properties, but the rest of it is just one big chunk of JSON, and it's up to you to go and deal with it. Now it is drilling down inline fragments. That's my type. Those are the properties of my type. I can get individual properties. So you can produce strongly typed models that fit your domain. So articles, press releases, whatever it may be. If you've got a schema associated with that and a component published with that schema, then those types will be injected into the GraphQL and be available in the public content API. It works for both pages, so you can have typed pages, regions on a page, components, and metadata. So all metadata can now be typed as well, which can be useful for configurations and so on and so forth. You can drill down through components and keyword links. So if you have a keyword link on or a component link field, then it knows what type of component it is, and then you can do an online fragment, which we saw, and then drill down, and you can carry on forever. So GraphQL all the way down. Documentation is done through the descriptions that you define in your schema, so it makes it easy for people to use. Hopefully it's intuitive, so anybody that's familiar with GraphQL can easily navigate through your content, and even without knowing the structure of the content, they can work it out because through introspection or similar to kind of like ideas. And yeah, if you publish content using a new schema, it dynamically appears in the API, and it's all done at runtime. So you don't have to restart the content service for any of this. It's literally publish, wait a few seconds for things to refresh, and away you go. So I mentioned introspection, and the idea there is so you can kind of get information about the underlying schema that the GraphQL endpoint's using, and this will allow you to return data types, the properties of those types, and the queries that are allowed on those types. And one of the pretty nice features of that is it allows you to create your entire data model just through like a code generator. So you could point a code generator at your content services endpoint, and that article type and the paragraph type and the YouTube video type could just automatically be consumed by the code generator and output all the boilerplate code to kind of deserialize and represent that type. So depending on what language you use, they're available for all manner of languages. But if you C#, it could generate your class definitions, and it can even, like, if they're good code generators, it can generate the actual GraphQL query for requesting those components. So in theory, you don't actually need to write GraphQL by hand. You can just use whatever the code generator has generated. Maybe it generates a proxy. There's several open source solutions to this for your desired language. That's just like a Google search away. Some are better than others. You can roll your own, of course, and open source it. That's always good. And a good code generator, again, it kind of will automatically deserialize all the models for you, so you don't actually need to bother, and then you can just use strong typed stuff in your web application, and away you go. So yeah, questions and answers. That was quite quick, but we've got 5 minutes left, I believe. So if there's any questions. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening, and yeah, have a good TXS. Thank you very much.